Hello and welcome to my revision video. This topic is knowledge from reason, and it's for AQA Philosophy specification 7171 and 7172. As I always say, these are revision videos only. They're not designed to be sort of comprehensive overviews of a particular topic. Okay, so if you've watched my first couple of videos on epistemology, you'll know that one of the debates that we've been having is what could be construed as good knowledge. So we've looked at justified true belief, then we looked at Edmund Getier's problems and attempts to resolve those problems. What we're going to start looking at in this video is basically the distinction in philosophy between rationalism and empiricism, and the topics that are seen through the lens of a priori and a posteriori knowledge and analytic and synthetic truths. So this video is sort of quite heavy in content. You may want to watch it in little sections, etc. But you know, it's one of those areas where you're going to have to get your head around the particular topics, the particular words, and specialist terms, and understand, you know, what you have, what you understand by those. Okay, I'm waffling on there. Okay, so the first thing that we're going to look at is basically some definitions. The first instance, we're going to talk about synthetic and analytic truths. So analytic truths describe the truth of a statement by virtue of their description. That sounds quite strange, but I'll give you an example. A triangle is a three-sided object. Now, no matter how hard you might want to argue, might want to have a discussion with your maths teacher, you couldn't think of an object which had four sides and which you could call a triangle. It just wouldn't make sense. So it's true by virtue of its description. The other classic example, bachelors being unmarried men. In contrast, synthetic truths describe the world as it is. The distinction between the two is that a denial of an analytical truth will lead to a logical contradiction. You can't have a four-sided object which is a triangle. However, the denial of a synthetic truth wouldn't necessarily lead to a logical contradiction. It might lead to a contradiction, but it wouldn't necessarily be illogical. Okay, the second set of terms that you're going to have to be familiar with are these terms about a priori and a posteriori knowledge. So a priori knowledge is gained without reference to an external world, whilst a posteriori knowledge can only be acquired through knowledge of the external world. So knowing that the sun is going to rise tomorrow isn't an example of a priori knowledge, it's an example of a posteriori knowledge. It's knowledge gained through observation. And in the ancient world, this distinction was seen in the distinct ideas of Plato and his pupil Aristotle. So that's the second set of terms that you're going to be familiar with. Okay, so what's the difference between rationalism and empiricism? Rationalists basically believe in analytic truths, whereas empiricists believe in synthetic truths. In terms of rationalists, they believe that some synthetic truths can be known a priori, whereas an empiricist believes that no synthetic truths can be known a priori and can only be known a posteriori. As I say, you might want to go over these bits over and over again because it's through familiarity that you'll come to terms with them, whereas at the moment you might be looking at this and being a little bit confused. Okay, so for the rationalist, the a priori acquisition of knowledge is undertaken through a process of, and again, two new key terms here, intuition and deduction. Okay, before I go on to this bit, I should also say that you will need to look at, when we're talking about intuition in a philosophical sense, we don't mean the same kind of intuition that we talk about when you kind of have a hunch about something. It's having intuition as we use it today is a much looser term than philosophical intuition. So have a look at that. Anyway, okay. So one of the big figures in philosophy is Descartes, and I've no doubt that you've heard of Descartes' meditations. So Descartes was a rationalist, and he sought to establish that some synthetic truths could be known a priori. And in order to do this, Descartes undertook an exercise in which he doubted everything, basically. And he did so by introducing these things called the three waves of doubt. The first of these is illusion. Basically, he says that when we use our senses are pretty good, but unfortunately they are also fallible on occasion. The second wave of doubt is that he says that basically there are times when you are dreaming about something and you are not conscious that you are dreaming, but you still nonetheless think that that dream is real. My classic example is waking up highly concerned that I hadn't done enough study and revision for my chemistry A-level. However, I wasn't even taking chemistry A-level, so I don't know where that dream came from, but it seemed very real to me. The third wave of doubt is deception. Basically, it is the fact that an evil demon may well be deceiving me, and may well be deceiving me even over simple concepts such as 1 + 1 = 2. This sort of argument that Descartes proposes is known as skepticism, and it seems to be an extreme form of skepticism because he is doubting absolutely everything in order to try and establish good foundations of knowledge. Okay, so Descartes undertakes this exercise in doubting everything, and the question that might be asked is, well, what can you know? And according to Descartes, the one thing that you can know is this very famous phrase, cogito ergo sum. Basically, in essence, it means, since I'm a thinking thing, I cannot doubt myself. And according to Descartes, this is an example of a clear and distinct idea or rational intuition. Okay, so Descartes then goes on to develop this in the trademark argument. And the trademark argument basically sets out a belief that for every cause there is an effect. And the notion of perfection that we have is the effect of a cause. And in Descartes' case, he argues that that cause, the idea of perfection in our minds, can only be the cause, can only be the effect of a cause from a perfect being, and that perfect being is God. And because God is a perfect being who's left this trademark in our minds of perfection, Descartes concludes that God wouldn't deceive us, and therefore the external world exists. So Descartes is basically proposing an argument for synthetic a priori here. He's basically saying that we can conjure up the external world, which according to empiricists we can only know a posteriori through a priori means. Now you can imagine that empiricists have taken him to task on this particular concept. Okay, so while Descartes remains an influential philosopher, his arguments that we can have a priori knowledge of external things such as God and the world have not convinced all. And in my philosophy class, I always ask people who's going to go over to one side or the other, who's a rationalist and who's an empiricist. You might want to give that some thought as to which arguments convince you the most. Okay, so the first philosopher that we're going to look at is David Hume. So in contrast to Descartes' rationalism, the empiricist David Hume considered that there were only two types of knowledge. The first one he called relations of ideas. These were analytic, they were a priori, and they were necessary. And the second one were matters of fact. They were synthetic, a posteriori, and contingent. And the distinction between the two concepts or theories of knowledge have come to be known as Hume's fork, something that you need to be familiar with. Okay, again, one other way of looking at knowledge is also to think about innate knowledge. So another way of acquiring a priori knowledge is through innateness. It's knowledge that we already possess. And that's famously illustrated in Plato's Meno, where a slave boy is asked by Socrates to double the area of a square. And despite not having studied geometry, Socrates, through a series of questions, enables the slave boy to double the area of a square. So, according to Plato, this demonstrates that the slave boy, despite not having any formal mathematical training, has some innate knowledge which he's able to use to solve the problem that he has given. Another example of innate knowledge is given by the philosopher Leibniz. His argument is that there are things called necessary and contingent truths. In the case of contingent truths, these could be true or false. It's certainly the case that given a scientific experiment where we have to boil water, that we should expect to see that water boil at 100 degrees centigrade. However, there might be occasions where that doesn't necessarily happen, and we can't then argue that it's a necessary truth. It could be contingent on various things happening. However, 2 plus 2 will always equal 4, and this truth, according to Leibniz, can be arrived at by reflecting on what is already in our minds. Useful quote to have. In contrast to Leibniz, and Leibniz's arguments were used as evidence, or not as evidence, I should say, clumsy term, but used in an argument against John Locke. But the famous philosopher John Locke, an empiricist, he said that rather than ideas about a priori knowledge, John Locke claimed that the human mind was a blank slate, or tabula rasa. He basically claimed that there were no innate ideas in your mind at all, and that these kind of concepts, things like beauty, which philosophers such as Plato would say is a kind of concept that already exists in your mind, are developed through a series of abstractions. In other words, in order to gain the idea of beauty, you will have seen lots of beautiful things, attractive looking people, beautiful sunsets, beautiful pictures, works of art, etc., etc., etc. And as a result of those kind of experiences, you come up with the notion of beauty. So as I say, the key concept here is that John Locke believes in the mind being a tabula rasa or blank slate. So unlike Descartes, who believes that the knowledge of God was innate, Locke points to examples such as different societies where the concept of God does not exist.